Okay guys, what do you call this sport? You would call this football, right? Would I offend you if I called this soccer?
Swings it in, Bridge gets ahead on it. There's the shot, they score!
Alright guys, it's time to settle this once and for all. So I've had a whole bunch of people leaving really angry and somewhat unhinged comments recently after hearing me refer to the sport as soccer and not football. Of course, if you know your history, you know that the word soccer actually originated in England, not the United States. And the more that you dig into this, the more that you're going to realize that the history of the name itself is kind of a mess. Now, if you're one of those people who thinks that the sport was originally invented by the Chinese, you shouldn't call it football anyway. So the old Chinese word is cuju, a classical Chinese term that literally means kick ball. There aren't a ton of references to cuju in classical Chinese literature, though you can find it in the famously obscene novel Jinping Mei, and no, I'm not translating this for you. The problem with cuju, of course, is that it was a totally different sport. It was probably more like modern hacky sack than association football. And there's really not a direct relationship between this game and the modern sport. Okay, you've got two types of people who are going to claim that the sport originated in like China or Egypt or Rome or whatever. The one type is your iconoclast. This is somebody who wants to show you that everything that you thought you knew about the sport is actually wrong. And the other one tends to be the nationalist. This is somebody who wants to prove that everything in the world actually originated in their country, and it's like important for them to prove that for one reason or another. Anyway, cuju is interesting to know about, but the origin of all of the sports that we think of as football actually come from the English schools of the 19th century. Actually, the sport originated with what they called mob football in medieval times. Despite what these relatively recent drawings show, it wasn't always played with something that even remotely resembled a modern football. Mob football had only the most basic of rules, if there were any rules at all. And you can still find variants of the old mob football games in certain places. This includes games that have survived for centuries now. Now this is an important point, by the way. The term football goes back to the 15th century, and you can find evidence of it all over English literature. The term football shows up in King Lear by William Shakespeare, for example. Football player is an insult here and refers to the maniac and uncivilized game of mob football at the time. You can find references to football matches in old newspapers, such as in this issue of the Ipswich Journal from September 17, 1791, and notice the cricket advertisements above and below. Because of the nature of the old mob game, the term football came to mean something being torn apart. For example, this 1820 article from the Morning Post in London talks about discontent resulting in a football of a party. Similarly, this 1820 political debate printed in Richmond, Virginia, refers to making a football of the U.S. Constitution, and notice that this comes from long before there was ever a game called football in the United States. And here's another example. A green bag went through the town on a pole and was then ripped apart by the populace as if it were a football. The more stuff that you read from those days, the more that you're going to realize that this term football was originally very negative. However, when the sport entered the schools and it was tamed and civilized and adapted, the name stuck. Now, one of the things that people misunderstand about the origins of all the different forms of football is that they really all come from like the same place. Believe it or not, American football is actually much closer to the original schoolyard games than the association football game. In fact, as recently as 1863, the Football Association's laws of the game included several features that you'd probably only associate with rugby and its variants. For example, the sport originally allowed a fair catch with the hands, which required the player catching the ball to first make a mark with his heel. This is a play that's quite famous in Australian rules football and American football to this day. Now, if you try a stunt like this today, you'll get nothing but a yellow card. Those old 1863 rules also had a rule that served as the equivalent of a try in rugby and is the origin of the touchdown in American football. And of course, in those days you kicked the ball over the crossbar for a goal, not under it. Now, you're probably wondering why in the world they would call the sport football if you could, catch the ball with your hands. Well, it seems that the term football originated in something like the 14th or 15th century to differentiate itself from sports that were played on horseback. In other words, it was football because you had to use your feet to run. It was for commoners. Now, if you read old newspapers, you'll have a problem distinguishing between the association game and the rugby game, since they were both referred to as football for years. By the 1890s, most references to football in the United States referred only to the college game played under Walter Camp's modified rules. Even still, association football was still called football in the United States, such as in this article from the New York Times in February 1894. And it's really important to note that the word soccer was not an American invention. Actually, it came from the schools of England in the 1880s, mostly in an attempt to distinguish association football from games like rugby. You can find the earliest references to soccer in sources like this letter from a student at Oxford University in 1885. In fact, the Oxford English Dictionary quotes that specific letter as the oldest known usage of the word soccer, so it is pretty old. And this article in Bailey's magazine in 1892 has the modern spelling of the word. Historians tend to agree that soccer came from the third, fourth, and fifth letters of the word association. If you look at that on paper, you'll see it says SOC. It was a lot easier to say soccer than association football. It's kind of like how it's a lot easier to say car than automobile, or radio than wireless, or flat than apartment, but those are linguistic debates for another day. Anyway, soccer was commonly used to describe the sport and its players by the middle of the 1890s. The word became especially popular in countries with alternative games also known as football, the United States, Canada, Australia, and so on. In other words, it's really not fair to consider the word soccer to be uniquely American, as many people do. While people will tell you that soccer was the upper-class term, you can easily find hundreds of counterexamples. For example, this 1950 article from the Daily Mirror isn't exactly a great representation of high society. By the middle of the 1960s, however, the word soccer was used sparingly in the United Kingdom and mostly for rhetorical effect. So in this article here, we're talking about soccer's problems, but in the football league. Anything negative winds up being termed soccer. And it's really starting in the middle of the 1960s that you see the word soccer viewed negatively in England. For some reason or other, people gradually decided that the word was some sort of American conspiracy, and it's been treated with hostility ever since. Meanwhile, in the United States, you could find the phrase soccer football in common use through the middle of the 1970s. And the same was true in Australia. Now, I'm not sure about Australia, but I know part of the problem in the United States is that the leading federation was called the United States Soccer Football Association. And it wasn't really until the North American Soccer League became a household word that the sport was universally referred to only as soccer in the United States. Anyway, if you're trying to make sense of all of this, it's actually not that hard. You call it football in most countries where English is the official language, like the United Kingdom, or even places like India or Singapore or Hong Kong and so on. However, if there is a local game that is also called football that is prominent, then you call the sport soccer. This is true in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, and also in certain parts of Ireland. But the really interesting thing here is that you've got other languages that use completely different terms to refer to the sport. So some of these are pretty obvious. For example, in German you talk about das Fußball, which is literally football. Similarly, in Greek you would call it ποδόσφαιρο, which literally means football. In Japan you can use the term futuboru, which of course means football. However, in Japan the word saka is much more common. And I know some of you are probably cringing to hear that. I guess you can blame that on the influence of that blasted American culture, the imperialism. However, you might be interested to know that the sport has other names in other Asian countries, and that these names really have nothing to do with imperialism at all. So I mentioned before the old Chinese word cuju, though it's an archaic term that nobody uses today. Now that first character cu in Chinese became shou in Japanese. Became shu in Japanese, leading to the term shukyu, which was used in Japan from around World War I until the end of World War II. And that term was exported to Korea, where it became chukgu, which is still the word for the sport in Korea to this day. Meanwhile, China and Taiwan both use the term zuqiu, a transliteration of the word football. In spoken Cantonese, however, you would say tekbo, which means kickball, and now we're back to something a little bit more like that old word suju. And finally, in Southern Min, or also Taiwanese Hokkien if you're in Taiwan, you'd say kakyu, another transliteration of the term football. So that's clear as mud, right? And then you've got the Italians. And I know that some of you have just been dying to hear this part. Now you can say football in Italian, sure, but the accepted term is calcio. Now that term comes from the old game called calcio storico fiorentino, which is another medieval form of football. And yes, people still do play that to this day. Anyway, there you have it. Now I'm going to be blunt. I don't care if you call it football or soccer or tsucho or whatever. However, before you get yourself into a stupid and massive and pointless internet debate over this idiotic topic, take the time to do at least a little bit of research, because you will find that it is a far more interesting and complex subject than you first realized.